Hello, I'm Miles Matoyer, and this is my lecture on libel, slander, and obscenity. For a quick introduction, libel, slander, and obscenity are concepts referring to the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. The First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution protects freedom of speech and the press, of course, but those rights aren't unlimited. The Supreme Court has ruled that certain types of speech are not protected, and these three types of speech are libel, slander, and obscenity. This means that if your free speech falls under these categories, you are not protected. And these limits help balance rights between free expression, but also protection from harm, defamation, and dangerous content. The courts play a massive role in defining and enforcing these rules through cases like New York Times versus Sullivan and Miller versus California. Now let's move on to libel. Libel is a written false statement that damages a person's reputation. And while the First Amendment protects freedom of speech in the press, it does not protect statements that are classified as libel. But since being unprotected by the First Amendment is so severe, the court has placed strong limits on what is and what is not libel, limits being considered even more in cases that involve public officials and figures. And this is important when we talk about civil liberties, the role of the media, and judicial power. A sample case of libel is New York Times versus Sullivan from 1964. In this case, the Supreme Court ruled that public officials must prove a written statement of libel was made with malice. This caused the establishment of the actual malice standard. Actual malice can be defined as the speaker knowing it was false or acting with reckless disregard for the truth before they said their thing. Some background on the case that we chose is a public official in Alabama sued the New York Times for libel over an ad that criticized the police department and its treatment of civil rights protesters. The official claimed that the ad had factual inaccuracies. Now let's talk about slander. Slander is a false, spoken statement that harms a person's reputation. It is the spoken equivalent of libel, and just like libel, slander is not protected speech under the First Amendment. However, because of the importance of free speech protections, the court set a high bar for what actually qualifies as slander, especially when it involves public figures or officials. And a sample case for slander is Milkovich versus Lorraine Journal Company in 1990. Some background on that case is Milkovich, a high school wrestling coach, was accused of lying under oath in a public controversy involving a fight at a wrestling match. A newspaper columnist wrote an article implying that Milkovich committed perjury, using language like, "anyone there knows he lied." Milkovich sued for defamation, and in the end, the court ruled in favor of Milkovich, allowing the case to go forward. The court said that these statements that appear to be opinions can still be defamatory if they apply an assertion of false fact. Now, it's still important to remember that not all opinions are protected if they imply a provably false statement. This case limited the defense that something was just that person's opinion, and it reinforces the fact that false implications can still be defamatory and therefore not protected under the First Amendment. Finally, let's wrap it up with obscenity. Obscenity is speech or material that is so offensive or explicit that it is not at all protected by the First Amendment. A sample case of obscenity was Miller versus California. And some background on that is Marvin Miller sent out unwanted advertisements for adult materials through the mail. The people who received them were offended and complained, and he was convicted under California law for distributing obscene materials. But the question of this case was, is the distribution of obscene materials protected by the First Amendment? And the Supreme Court ruled against Miller, saying obscene materials are not protected by the First Amendment. And the court used this case to establish something called the Miller test, which can be defined by three criteria. They ask, are the images overtly sexual? Are they patently offensive? And do they have no serious value? And if materials meet these three criteria, they're declared obscene and therefore not protected by the First Amendment. And this is something that the courts still use today from all the way back in 1973. And that just about wraps up this lecture of libel, slander, and obscenity. I hope you guys learned something. Thank you, and have a great day.